Please, another round of applause for your chair. So, since I know you guys paid mostly for the food and not so much for the speakers, I'm going to try to be entertaining and as brief as possible. But I do want to kind of frame the where we are, right? I think all of us have, gone and exceeded our capacity in terms of what we see every day on CNN and MSNBC, and we've become, as Fannie Hamer would say, sick and tired of being sick and tired at this point. But also understanding that with that frustration can sometimes create a sense of hopelessness. And I want to push back against that, right? This idea that because, of certain things not going our way or breaking our way, that somehow it feels futile with the efforts that we're trying to do. So, in the drive over here, so I'm from Miami. A little background on me is, as Neil pointed out, represented a large swath of Miami-Dade County, both in the House and in the Senate, Florida Senate.
You told me he was the treasurer.
But where I really kind of met Neil was when I was in the state Senate. I also represented all of Monroe County, portion of Collier County, including Immokalee, as well as all of Hendrick County. So I'm coming up Highway 27,
the new treasurer,
on my way here, and I'm reminiscing a little bit about what it was like to serve.
I was thinking
and
secretary.
be accountable
I might have written down
to people.
treasurer.
And so, in thinking about that, and also recognizing that we're in the midst of Black History Month, I started thinking about three particular figures and some of the words that they shared that made them so famous, and kind of thinking about what we need to do in terms of our next steps, right? So, Frederick Douglass, for those of you familiar with Frederick Douglass, of course, an abolitionist, as we know, author, orator. One thing that I found out was very interesting was he was the most photographed individual of the 19th century, even more so than any other president, right? So we're talking about someone who was famous beyond famous, and would be considered super famous in the modern context. But he also has the quote that says, "Power concedes nothing without the man. It never has and it never will," right? So when we think about this notion of being helpless or powerless, we have to embrace the idea that we do possess power. Yes. We do possess the power to change. We do possess the power to advocate. We do possess the power to instruct and inform. And I want you to think about that in the context of Frederick Douglass for a second. We're talking about someone who was born into slavery in Maryland. Broken apart from his mother at an early age. He just celebrated what would have been his 201st birthday recently because he was a Valentine's baby. But goes on to become, as I mentioned, the most famous individual in the Americas, advocating for something that America did not want to recognize, and that is the ills of slavery. So for the entirety of his adult life, he traveled the country, oftentimes with a bounty on his head, advocating that America could be as good as its promise. And faced with the reality that A, his life was in danger most of that time, and that the sentiment for the country was not one that embraced fully the idea of freedom. Right? So we talk about this word freedom, and he understood that for millions of people in the country at the time, the physical embodiment of freedom did not exist. Yet and still, he not only put into words, but into action, the abolition and the freedom of millions of people. So the reason I bring this up is because oftentimes I'm sure it felt daunting for him to face down literally the barrel of guns, the idea of not only advocating for his own inherent freedom, but for the freedom of people he had yet to meet.
She can speak.
The freedom of people he had yet to really
Are you sure? Yeah, I'm probably.
understand or get by. People who would never, ever get a chance to shake his hand or meet him is who he advocated for. So again, I want you to think about that quote. Power concedes nothing without demand. We have to be willing to demand, willing to fight, willing to advocate, and willing to be accountable to those who we don't know. Beyond just Highlands County. Highlands County is part of a larger system of counties that are interconnected in so many different ways, and Highlands is just as important as any of the other 66 counties in making sure that we have our freedom. Another important figure in American history that we oftentimes don't recognize is probably one of the greatest union leaders to ever exist, and that is A. Philip Randolph.
Yes.
Asa Philip Randolph, right? So he founds this organization called the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, really the first African-American union to exist when many unions prohibited African-Americans from participating in their ranks. He established this organization and is described as, and I quote, the most dangerous Negro in America. Not by other black people, but by government officials, folks who understood that his organizational power and the power and sway that he had over the individuals, not only in his union, but nationally, could tip the scales in terms of the momentum that we think about, right? And he oftentimes did it behind the scenes. He was never really a visible, in the front, advocating out in front kind of individual. He was always somebody who understood that true leadership does not require you to be in the spotlight or getting the marquee, right? And he's quoted as saying, freedom is never given, it is won. Freedom is never given, it is won. Now, how does he do this? How does he go about this? A lot of folks don't appreciate this, but in 1941, he was organizing what he called a March for Jobs and Freedom on Washington, D.C. The mobilization of hundreds of thousands of individuals simply demanding that the New Deal reflect its promise. If you're going to provide economic security for one segment of the population, then black people should have also been included. A lot of people don't want to recognize that, but let's name that, right? That the New Deal was not as inclusive as it needed to be. There were prohibitions in it. And for all the greatness that Franklin Roosevelt brought during his tenure as presidency, that is always going to be one of the asterisks with the idea that the New Deal was not inclusive. So Asa Philip Randolph decides we're going to mobilize thousands of people to Washington, D.C. to make a statement and make a demand that we deserve equal rights and equal treatment under the law. But he also understood the critical nature of the time that he was going, because it was also being planned when a little thing called Pearl Harbor happens. Now, Asa Philip Randolph had a decision to make. As someone who believed in the promise of America, A. Philip Randolph could have gone up there and marched despite the fact that we're in a moment of extreme patriotism, or he could fall back on the moment and recognize that his promise of being an American was more important at that moment than the demand. But he also recognized again that freedom is never given, it is won. Now I want to land on that for 2 seconds, because when we talk about the notion of winning, we have to understand that winning an election, winning a state, winning party affiliation is deeper than just that. We can't just get consumed in the tactical nature of things. We have to understand why we are doing it and what we are doing it for. You know, again, as I drove up Highway 27, you see countless folks who are out here struggling each and every day. The idea that the federal minimum wage is still $7.25, the idea that the tip minimum wage is $2.13 in America should make us all cringe. Because we know all too well that people cannot afford to exist. People cannot afford to capture the idea of the American dream because of politics and a lack of courage. So we have to be resolute and committed, not only as members of the DEC, but as human beings, to recognize that we're making this fight not just for ourselves, but for our friends and neighbors who struggle each and every day to make ends meet. When we think about the notion of a government shutdown, the most recent one, 35 days. 35 days, and we talk about people who did not get paychecks. Let's dive deeper. For 35 days, the 1%ers that make up the real 1%, which is our military, did not get paid for 35 days. We're talking about people still stationed in Iraq and Afghanistan. We're talking about those individuals who are literally putting their lives on the line to protect our freedoms, went unpaid, with no apology. To this day, no one's gotten on your TV screen to say, I'm sorry to the American soldier. Let's take it a step further. Individuals who are making the federal minimum wage and getting federal employment still will not get recovery funds. So even when they furlough you and then return your dollars to you, those individuals who went 35 days, who were hourly employees, just went 35 days without and no recovery. And they deserve an apology. But more importantly, they deserve a win. They deserve a win. So when we're thinking about the notion again, and the cornerstone of this concept of freedom, we have two individuals, Frederick Douglass and A. Philip Randolph, who talk about this notion of freedom.
Yes.
One recognizing that it will not be given without a demand, and another person recognizing that it will not be given without winning it. It cannot be given to you. You have to demand it, you have to take it, you have to rip it away from those in power who try to keep it from you. Now, a third individual who we all know also understood a key component in that, and that is Dr. Martin Luther King, right? Dr. King oftentimes said that only love can defeat hate. So what I mean by this is we oftentimes get captivated and caught up watching the news and learning to hate other people. You know, we criticize, we're critical of those who espouse hate, but not checking ourselves and our own hate that we're now developing for those that are ultimately trying to do us wrong. Dr. King recognized this very early on, that the only way to defeat that hate is to espouse the notion of love. Now, I know some of us, it's a complicated concept, this idea, right? How do we love this person who clearly does not have our best interests in mind? And I'm not asking you to lock arms and embrace. I'm not asking you to develop some sort of flirtatious love for another person. But it has to be a recognition that in order for us to cure the ills of society, in order for us to get the wins, in order for us to make the demand, we have to do it through the prism of love. We have to do it through the prism of love. And that's going to be an understanding that there are folks out here that still are impacted by years and decades of misunderstandings, levels of ignorance, and an ability to understand that we, as an American society, thrive in our diversity.
Yes.
And I want everyone to sort of cement yourself in that. Because too oftentimes we talk about, as Democrats, this notion of this big tent. But then under that tent, we have these silos of individuals who are not talking to each other. Here's what I recognized as an elected official when I was elected. That gay and lesbian couples still want good schools for their children. Just like grandparents who don't have children in schools. that whether you're white, black, Asian, you want to be able to go home with the expectation that you will not be shot in your front yard by the police or by an assailant from your own community. That's a universal understanding. The idea that when you work a job for 40 hours, regardless of where what your background is, what your degree is, that you'll be able to afford a lifestyle befitting a human being is something that is universal. But the inherent problem is that we get caught up in these social norms and ideas that I cannot talk to another human being because they are them and I am me. And these barriers now must be created for me to not share a common thread of humanity with this person. And Dr. King understood all too well that that's a false statement. That's an indictment on us, that we've allowed our society to roll back to a point where we can no longer have commonality, discussions, and common interest be the thing that guides us moving forward. In 1996, Bob Dole didn't hate Bill Clinton. He didn't. They oftentimes worked together on bills. Tip O'Neill didn't hate Ronald Reagan. Barack Obama shows up on the scene, and all of a sudden, this festering hate comes up because we don't know who he is or what he's about. And for those of us that are defenders of his presidency, we've done a pretty piss-poor job of defending it. And what I mean by that is that for someone who brings us from the brink of financial disaster, for someone that understands that fighting wars that cost us more money and more lives than getting any return on that investment should be ended, is something that we should have been applauding and that we should defend to the hilt. Because now we see the antithesis. Now we see the antithesis. So now we have to double down on the idea that we know what love looks like. We know what promise, we know what a commitment to humanity, we know what it is to understand and embrace our brothers more so now than ever. But the reason that we could potentially lose in 2020 is because we have a failure to commit to what we already know, which is that simple philosophy of the golden rule that I will do unto others as I would have them do unto me. Right? If that is at its core, now mind you, all the Abrahamic faiths, I don't know who's in the room who believes in what, but I mean all the Abrahamic faiths have that as a core principle. So whether you are Muslim, Christian, or Jewish, that should be the resident fact. If you are agnostic or atheist, the idea that you should be able to carry a sense of respect and self-governance is a core principle. So I'll leave you with this. If nothing else, remember at their core these three quotes, and I'll say them again. Power conceives nothing without the man. It never has and never will. Freedom is never given, it is won. And only love can conquer hate. Those three things we all need to walk away with. Live them, embody them, and perpetuate them from now through 2020, through the end of our lives, because that's the only way we can win. Thank you all so much.
It has to be good. Oh, I think